he asked. "Young lady, what are you drawing?" Startled, Amara quickly tried to hide the paper, afraid he might laugh at her like her relatives once did. But the man smiled and insisted gently, "Please let me see." With trembling hands, she showed him the sketch. The man's eyes widened. "You drew this? Without a ruler? Without training?" Amara nodded shyly. I love buildings," she whispered. He introduced himself as Mr. Obi, an engineer working on a construction project nearby. He sat beside her, flipping through her notebook, amazed at her talent. "These are not just drawings," he said, shaking his head. "This is a gift. Do you go to school?" His question made Amara's throat tighten. She looked down and whispered, "No." I had to stop. For a moment Mr. Obi said nothing. Then he leaned closer and told her about a scholarship program for underprivileged youth with special talents. "I think you should apply," he said firmly. "You belong in school, not on these streets." Amara's heart raced. Was this real? Could someone like her, hungry, poor, forgotten, really have such a chance? That night she couldn't sleep. She kept hearing his words, replaying them in her mind like a song. "You belong in school." With Mr. Obi's help, she applied for the scholarship. Weeks later, she received a letter that made her hands shake as she opened it. She had been accepted. She had been given a full scholarship to study architecture at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. The moment she read those words, tears rolled down her cheeks. For the first time, the doors of her dream opened. She wasn't holding a tray of bread anymore. She was holding the key to her future. Fear sat beside her. Fear of failing, fear of not fitting in, but hope stood taller, pushing her forward. When Amara walked through the gates of the university for the first time, her small notebook was still in her bag. But now, those sketches weren't just dreams hidden on scraps of paper. They were the beginning of a journey that would change her life forever. And deep inside she whispered, "One day they will see me." When Amara stepped into the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, she felt like she had walked into another world. The tall buildings, the large lecture halls, the confident students in neat clothes. All of it felt overwhelming. She clutched her small bag tightly, aware that her own clothes were old and faded. From the very first day, she noticed the stares. Some students whispered, some laughed. A group of girls even giggled and said loudly, "Look at her shoes. Does she think she belongs here?" Amara's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She told herself, "I didn't come here to impress anyone. I came here to win." Life on campus was not easy. The scholarship covered her tuition, but she still needed money for books, food, and other expenses. To survive, she took on night shifts, cleaning small shops, arranging shelves in supermarkets, sometimes even helping at construction sites where she learned more about buildings. She often came back to her dorm at dawn, too tired to eat, yet she still dragged herself to class. There were nights when she wanted to collapse. Her hands would shake from exhaustion, and her eyes would blur from lack of sleep. But every time she thought of quitting, she remembered her mother's words, the sting of that slap, and the humiliation in front of her relatives. That pain became her power. She whispered to herself, "I will prove them wrong." Her professors quickly noticed her dedication. While many students struggled with complex design assignments, Amara would hand in detailed work that looked almost professional. When asked how she managed, she would smile quietly, never revealing that she had sketched most of her designs during her night shifts, sometimes by the light of a single bulb. Her classmates, who once mocked her, began to notice. Soon she was no longer just the poor girl with worn-out clothes. She became the girl who never sleeps. But behind the nickname was a deeper truth. Amara wasn't just staying awake for grades. She was staying awake for survival, for her dream, for the promise she made to herself the night she walked away from home. By the end of her first year, she shocked everyone by topping her class. Professors praised her work in lectures, using her projects as examples for others. Students who once laughed at her now asked for her help. She had turned her pain into her strength, her hunger into her focus. Amara knew the journey was still long, but each achievement felt like another brick laid in the foundation of the future she was building. She was no longer just a girl running away from her mother's slap. She was becoming a woman rising toward greatness. Every time she walked through the campus, tired but unbroken, she carried a silent promise in her heart. That slap will never define me. My success will. In her final year at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, Amara poured her whole heart into her project. While other students chose designs that were flashy and modern, she thought about the families she had seen struggling in villages. Families with leaking roofs, broken walls, and no proper shelter. She wanted to create something different, something that mattered. Her idea was a sustainable housing design, affordable, strong, and built with local materials so even the poorest families could have a safe home. For weeks, she barely slept. She sketched during the day, modeled structures at night, and read everything she could find about sustainable design. Her classmates sometimes laughed. "Why waste time on poor people's houses?" one student teased. But Amara only smiled and kept working. Deep inside, she knew this project wasn't just for her degree. It was her way of giving back, of proving that architecture could change lives. When she finally presented her design, the room went silent. Professors leaned forward, impressed by the creativity and practicality. One of them told her, "Amara, this is more than a project. This is a vision." Soon after, her work was submitted to an international competition in Johannesburg, South Africa. Weeks later, the news arrived. Amara had not only been selected, she had won first place. The girl once mocked for wearing torn shoes and selling bread was now celebrated on an international stage. Her name appeared in newspapers across Nigeria. Young architect wins big in South Africa. Journalists called her the rising star of African design. When she traveled to Johannesburg to receive her award, Amara stood on stage in front of people from different countries. She wore a simple dress, not expensive, but her presence was powerful. As she held the trophy in her hands, her mind flashed back to the nights she slept hungry, the days she scrubbed floors, the sting of her mother's slap. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were tears of triumph. After that moment, everything changed. Companies across Africa began reaching out to her, offering partnerships and opportunities. Some wanted her designs for rural projects. Others invited her to speak about innovation and affordable housing. Suddenly, the girl once called nothing was being called a visionary. Back on campus, her fellow students looked at her with awe. Professors spoke of her project with pride. Even those who once mocked her admitted she had achieved something extraordinary. But for Amara, the victory was more than fame. It was proof that pain could be turned into power, that rejection could become redirection. She carried her award home with quiet dignity, whispering to herself, "They thought I was useless. Now the world knows my worth." It wasn't just a win for her. It was the beginning of a legacy. The dream that had started in a small notebook on the streets of Onitsha had now crossed borders, shining far beyond what anyone had ever imagined. Years passed, and Amara's name had become known far beyond Nigeria. Her designs were changing lives, her face appeared in magazines, and her voice was heard at international conferences. But deep inside, she always remembered where it all began. The streets of Enugu, the slap that broke her heart, and the humiliation that had once burned her spirit. So when she decided to return home, it wasn't just a visit. It was a statement. The day she arrived, the entire neighborhood gathered at the sound of a sleek black car pulling up in front of her mother's house. The car door opened, and Amara stepped out, tall and confident, dressed in a simple but elegant suit. For a moment, silence fell over the crowd. Cousins who once laughed at her stood frozen. Uncles who shook their heads in disappointment years ago now whispered in disbelief. Children pointed excitedly, not fully understanding but sensing something powerful. Nena, her mother, came out slowly. Her hands trembled as she saw her daughter again. Not the girl she slapped, not the child she mocked, but a woman transformed. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Later that evening, a family meeting was held. The compound was full of relatives, their faces curious and stunned. Amara stood before them, calm and graceful. Instead of anger or bitterness, she carried papers in her hand. "I came back," she said softly, her voice steady, "not to remind you of the past, but to show you what the future can look like." She announced a large donation to rebuild schools in the community, schools where children could dream freely without fear of being silenced. Murmurs spread across the room. Some clapped immediately, others sat speechless, still trying to understand how the same girl they once dismissed had risen so high. Nena sat quietly in a corner, her eyes filling with tears. For the first time she had no insults, no harsh words. Her daughter was no longer someone she could control. She was someone the entire community admired. The same relatives who once mocked Amara now applauded her, praising her name, calling her a blessing to the family. The sound of clapping filled the compound, but for Amara, the loudest sound was the silence of her mother. She glanced at her, remembering the pain of that night long ago, but she stood tall. This was her victory. Not to humiliate her mother, but to rise so high that the world itself could never deny her worth again. That night, as the applause echoed, Amara knew she had finally come full circle. The once slapped daughter was no longer a burden, no longer a girl begging for approval. She was a celebrated architect, welcomed home not with mockery, but with respect, honor, and pride. And deep in her heart she whispered, "This is only the beginning." That night, after the family meeting ended and the relatives left, the compound grew quiet. The laughter, the applause, and the whispers faded into the dark. Only Amara and her mother, Nena, remained inside the small house where so much pain had once lived. 4 years they had been apart, but now they faced each other again, not as mother and child in conflict, but as two women carrying heavy memories. Nena's hands trembled as she poured water into a glass. She could not look at her daughter directly. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "Amara," she whispered, "I need to tell you something." Her eyes filled with tears as she set the glass aside. "The night I slapped you, I thought I was protecting you. I thought marriage would secure your future. I wanted to control your path because I was afraid you would fail. But I didn't know I was pushing you away." Her voice cracked, and the tears she had buried for years spilled freely down her cheeks. Amara stood still, her heart tightening. For so long she had dreamed of this moment. Her mother admitting the pain she caused. Slowly she stepped closer. Her eyes softened as she looked at the woman who had once been her greatest source of both love and hurt. "Mama," she said quietly, "that slap broke me in ways you may never understand. It wasn't just the pain on my cheek. It was the feeling that my own mother didn't believe in me. I carried that wound for years." Her voice grew stronger, steady but emotional. "But, Mama, it also became my strength. Every time I wanted to quit, I remembered that night. Your slap hurt me, but it also made me rise higher than I ever thought I could." Nena covered her face with her hands, weeping harder. "I was wrong, Amara. I was blind. I didn't see who you truly were. I see it now, and I am ashamed." Amara gently reached for her mother's hands and lowered them. Looking straight into her eyes, she spoke firmly but with love. "I forgive you, Mama, but I will never forget. The pain will always be part of my story, but so will my victory. And today I stand here not because you stopped me, but because I refused to stop." For the first time in years, mother and daughter embraced, their tears mixing together. It was not a perfect healing, but it was a beginning. Nena cried on her daughter's shoulder, whispering, "I am proud of you, more than words can ever say." In that small, quiet house in Enugu, two women faced the truth of their past. The slap that once divided them had now become the bridge that reminded them both of resilience, forgiveness, and the power of rising higher than anyone ever dreamed. The hall in Lagos was filled with people from different countries. Leaders, innovators, students, and dreamers. Cameras flashed, lights shone brightly, and all eyes turned to the stage as Amara walked up with calm confidence. She was no longer the girl who once sold bread on the streets or cried herself to sleep at night. She was now a woman whose story had crossed borders. Taking a deep breath, she began. "I was told I was nothing. Even my own mother once slapped me for daring to dream of a different future. People laughed at me, mocked me, and told me to give up. But I stand here today as proof that no one decides your worth but you." The hall went silent for a moment, every word sinking deep into the audience's hearts. Then, as if on cue, The entire room erupted into applause. People stood to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Amara's words had touched something universal: the pain of being doubted, the strength of rising despite it. Her story spread quickly across Africa. Newspapers, blogs, and television stations shared her speech, not just as a tale of success, but as a symbol of hope. Young girls in villages whispered her name with pride, students in universities quoted her words, and mothers told their children, "If Amara could rise, so can you." It was no longer about the slap, the humiliation, or the hunger. It was about the woman who turned every wound into fuel, every insult into determination, and every obstacle into a stepping stone. Amara had risen higher than anyone ever dreamed, and now she was helping others rise too.